So tonight I'm talking about Sangharakshita's life, which is very fitting, seeing as we're coming up to his 87th birthday on Sunday. And I'm also going to talk about the specific or particular emphases of the Triratna Buddhist community, which very much come out of his life and his thinking. So this talk is part of a series we've been doing for nearly a year now. The series is looking at what's called the Refuge Tree of the Triratna Buddhist community. And if you remember seeing that the big picture we've had up before, Sangharakshita is of course very primary in that. It's very much a refuge tree that comes out of Sangharakshita, his teachings, his teachers. And so we're just starting a series, a mini-series within that series, which is about looking at Sangharakshita and particularly the Triratna Buddhist community. So very much today I'm doing an overview. I'm looking at Sangharakshita's life, some of his life, and then I'm just talking about some of these emphases because there will be talks coming up in the next 3 or 4 weeks where some of them are gone into in more detail. Okay, so I suppose if we look around us at the moment, here we are in this quite amazing and very beautiful Buddhist centre, and there are lots of activities go on. So there's meditation and classes, people studying the Dharma. There's lots of friendliness, people drinking tea, that kind of stuff. Hopefully, from the centre and from all that, there are kind of little bits of ripples of sanity going out into the world. So there's a bit of a kind of rippling out of kindness, of awareness, coming from us as we meet other people. All the other people who come to the centre, who come to the newcomers' classes, all changing a little bit how they react with other people. And that's kind of going out into the world and having an effect. And hopefully as well, people here are having more of an insight into reality. We're actually understanding reality better, acting more in accord with reality, and that is having an effect in the world as well. And it's not just here in Sheffield that that's happening, it's also in lots of other parts of the world. So in India, there are many people involved with our movement. In fact, about a fifth of the people involved with our movement are living in India. In Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Mexico, continental Europe, other UK centres. Somebody kind of independent to the Triratna Buddhist community estimated a few years ago that it was around about 100,000 people worldwide who were kind of touched in some way, friends, mitras, order members. And I presume that's more now actually, because that was a few years ago. Though I did get that off Wikipedia actually, so it might not be the most. I should say that. If there's any scholars here, I'm not sure how accurate that is. Anyway, it's a good number, isn't it? 100,000 people. Okay, so I suppose where does all that come from? Well, it comes from the work of many, many people, many people here, but a lot of work and love and care into developing the activities here. But actually, it very much comes from the vision and the inspiration of one individual man, the man who founded the Triratna Buddhist community, who's called Sangharakshita. So I'm going to talk a little bit about his life. And he's written a lot of memoirs, so if you're intrigued and you haven't already, you can explore and read his memoirs if you want to. And then I'm going to look at what we call these 6 distinctive emphases. Because of course, the Triratna Buddhist community has loads in common with other Buddhist groups. It's the same teachings, I hope. It's things like the 4 Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, ethics, meditation and wisdom. You'll come across them whichever Buddhist group you go to, I imagine. But because the Triratna Buddhist community was founded at a particular time in the West, actually, and also in India, and by a particular person, it does have some particular things that are not exactly special to us that we particularly emphasise. So that's what I'm looking at. Okay, so Sangharakshita, or Dennis Lingwood, his parents didn't call him Sangharakshita. Dennis Lingwood was born in London, in Tooting, and in 1925, and he came from a working class background. I think his father actually was unemployed quite a lot during the 30s, and he was very much self-educated. And in one of his talks he does kind of a really interesting comparison with the life of Dada Rinpoche, who was a very good friend of his, who you might have heard us talk about before. I think Vidania talked about Dada Rinpoche before. So Sangharakshita and Dada Rinpoche in India had a very good friendship. But Sangharakshita, in one of his talks, compares himself. So he says, so Dada Rinpoche, well, he was born at Tolku. So he was born, you know, that kind of Tibetan thing where people go off and look for the next rebirth of the Lama, and there's all that kind of stuff to do. And he was spotted as one of those people. And he came from a wealthy family, and he had the best education. He gave fantastic education in terms of Tibetan Buddhist teachings. And he was a bodhisattva. Okay? Whereas Sangharakshita says of himself, well, you know, he was born in Tuti to a working class family, didn't really have very good education at all, kind of left school when he was 16, spent a lot of time at home actually being educated, and was quite grumpy, not a bodhisattva, he says. So I think it's quite interesting if you look at, like, he's very much a Westerner from London who started off this movement. Okay, so his parents, he says, were very loving and supportive parents actually. And, but when he was about 8, a kind of big thing happened to him, is that a doctor listened to his heart and thought that he had a weakness in his heart that meant that he had to go to bed immediately and not do anything, okay, and be kept completely quiet. So I think what his parents did was they just brought him loads of stuff to read. So they brought him loads of novels, and particularly an encyclopedia that he just completely devoured, like one of those big old encyclopedias with loads and loads of different sections to it. After 2 years of that, another doctor came and listened to his heart and said, there's nothing wrong here. So he was able just to get up again gradually and to go about things. But I think that was really important, that those years that he spent reading. And also that he said from an early age himself, he was aware that his mind worked a little bit faster than that of people around him. I think he just kind of, his mind is quite incredible, and I think the thing about all that reading that he did is that he remembered it. So I read quite a lot, but I don't remember it at all. Whereas everything it seems that he's read, he kind of has some recall of. He thinks about it and he remembers it. Okay. So he realised quite early on in his life, I think when he was about 14, I think there might be another picture of him as a boy. Yes. So this is for you. Oh. I don't know if that's before he had to go to bed for 2 years or not. Anyway, when he was about 14, he realised that he wasn't a Christian, but he didn't know what he was, but had a really strong understanding of that. And then when he was 16, he read the Diamond Sutra and the Sutra of, the Platform Sutra, and he realised he was definitely a Buddhist. He had like a big experience actually. He could, I mean, the Diamond Sutra is just complete mind-boggling stuff if you ever tried to read it. But to him it made sense. It was like a really big, I imagine that he felt like, well, this is it, I'll come home to this. But the war broke out around that time, so he spent a year or so working in the coal trade, and then 2 years in local government before he was conscripted to the army. And he was sent at the age of 19 to India. There he is, don't know where that is. So that's him in the army. And whilst, first of all, he went to India, then to Sri Lanka, and then to Singapore, and then he came back to India. And during that time, he made contact with Buddhists and with Hindu teachers as well. Started meditating. And when his military service finished, he was meant to go back to the UK, but he actually slipped away from it, and he didn't exactly kind of go AWOL, but I suppose he basically did, because he didn't go back to the UK, he just stayed in India. And then he spent 2 years as an ascetic, wandering about with a friend. Often on foot, just begging for alms, just like kind of traditional old-style monks. So wearing robes and begging. And it's quite interesting actually, because there's a couple of stories I really like, because it kind of shows like his idealism and how it didn't quite measure up to the reality of what it was like. So one was that he and his friend, as soon as they decided they were going to go forth and become wandering monks, they burnt all their identity cards and passports and things like that, because they didn't want to have an identity. They wanted to kind of burn this and get rid of it. But then they really wanted to go to Sri Lanka, so they went all the way down to the end of India to go to Sri Lanka, but they weren't allowed on the boat. Well, they weren't allowed to go to Sri Lanka because they didn't have any ID. So it was like they had to kind of come back again. And the second thing they really wanted to do was walk from the bottom of India right to the top of India. But they soon realised that if you're walking every day, it's really hard to have a good meditation practice as well. So they ended up settling somewhere. But anyway, I think it was a really important couple of years for him and his friend. And also I think it's important to remember that this is like a good 20 years before it became fashionable to go to India and be a hippie and kind of wander about. It was kind of very much coming from a different way of looking at the world. He wasn't like whatever it was that hippies were doing. He was very much, he wanted to be a monk, a Buddhist monk. So he met with a variety of people. And Vidania talked about this last week in some detail, so I'm just going to kind of skip over it. But basically he was ordained in 1950. That's, yes, not a very easy picture to see maybe, but that is just after his ordination ceremony in 1950, given the name Sangharakshita. It means protected by the Sangha. You often may also hear Sangharakshita called Bhante. And what Bhante literally means is venerable sir. It's just a very kind of, it's a form, I think, of respect and affection that's used with Theravadan monks. So Bhante simply is, that's all it means. So if you hear someone talking about Bhante, it's just a kind of general term which means, yeah, venerable sir. Okay, so as you'll have heard last week if you were here from Vidania, Sangharakshita was then asked by his teacher to go and to stay in Kalimpong, a little town up in the foothills of the Himalayas, and to work for the good of Buddhism. And he stayed there, founded a Buddhist organisation, where I think they played a lot of table tennis. So that's why we have table tennis here somewhere. And grew a lot of vegetables as well, actually, it appears. So, but he also did a tremendous amount of other work as well, actually. He set up a Buddhist magazine and started and carried on writing. And in 1957, when he was just 27, 28, the Survey of Buddhism was published, which is a big book which looks at all sorts of, basically brings together the core teachings of Buddhism. And it's quite a dazzling and quite an amazing achievement that he wrote that at the age of 27, 28. Sometimes I think he was very inspired. He felt like something was coming through him when he was writing it. And I think in some ways it's very much his kind of key work. It's where he brings together all these different aspects of Buddhism and talks about what's in common with them. He also, every year, as well as writing, as well as running the organisation for Buddhists in Kalimpong, he'd go on tours in the plains of India every year, teaching. So, there he is, teaching. Okay, this is him maybe writing the Survey of Buddhism, I don't know. I'm kind of imagining that's him writing the Survey of Buddhism. So you can see that he's dressed, you know, in monk's yeah, he's dressed in traditional monk's costume. Then an important part of the work that he did was to get involved with the new Buddhists in India. So the next picture is of Dr. Ambedkar. So Dr. Ambedkar was an amazing figure. I won't say too much about him today, there isn't much time. But he basically came from the community, the ex-untouchable community in India, and he rose very high. He wrote the Constitution of India, the current Constitution of India. And after a lot of thought, he converted to Buddhism. He stepped right out of Hinduism, converted to Buddhism, and hundreds of thousands of people converted with him. In that one step, they took themselves out of the caste system. And Sangharakshita met Dr. Ambedkar quite a few times, and a link developed that has gone on in the Triratna Buddhist community ever since, a very strong link between India and between the West. And as I said, you know, many of the members of our movement are Indians. Okay, so maybe the next one. I don't know how much you can see this. So in the mid-60s, he came to England, to London. And this is the Hampstead Vihara. And I love this. I don't know if you can see these ladies, but they're just really kind of, they've got pearls on and all that stuff. And I suppose that's probably how you dressed in that time. But that was the kind of culture that some of the culture that he came across when he first came to England. Some of the Buddhist groups there, they were very much a kind of, it was very middle class, it was very theoretical, it was talking about Buddhism. It was like even thought it was a bit too much for Westerners to meditate. You know, it was very much a kind of, so he came into that environment. But also, but it was also different times as well. Actually, this is probably the 70s. This is with Kamalashila, I think, he's coming in quite soon. So Bhante himself at that time, or Sangharakshita himself at that time, Well, he came in the mid-60s, went back to India, came back again, and settled here in sort of 66, 67. So it was a really interesting time. And he was very much part of that kind of counterculture that was developing. So he developed a kind of shaman kind of persona. He grew his hair really long. So sometimes he'd be wearing robes, and he'd have really long hair and big sideburns, and loads of rings, and he had a kind of way of being that people write about. You know, they'd see him walking through the streets of London, and he had quite an impression. He was quite a unique figure, I think. Let's see what the next one is. I just had to put that one in. Anyway. So when he came to the UK, after a while, after some problems with some of the existing Buddhist movements already in the UK, he realised that he was going to have to actually set up a new movement. And actually he didn't really want to do that. It's not like he was one of those kind of people who were always trying to set up new things. Partly he's a traditionalist, so he just really wanted to, if he could, to work with what was already there. And secondly, he's very much a poet, perhaps a mystic as well. So he writes a lot of poetry and has a very rich inner life. So I think the thought for him of having to come out and lead this movement is not what he ideally would have liked to have done. And he also has a feeling about himself, because he's so self-educated, he felt that scholars wouldn't respect him as a teacher. So again, he thought he wasn't exactly the right person to lead the movement. But it was kind of, I think he looked around and there wasn't anybody else. And he could really see that there was a need in Britain at that time for a form of Buddhism that wasn't just reflecting the Asian culture that it came from. So people were starting to come, Theravada monks were starting to come. There were monks coming from Sri Lanka or from Thailand and setting up Buddhist movements. Tibetans were starting to come to the West as well. But they obviously brought with them a particular cultural way of approaching Buddhism. And I think Sangharakshita very much saw that with all the change that was going on around in this late 60s culture, that there was a very different way that Buddhism could be expressed in the West. That's why you probably know that the Triratna Buddhist movement used to be called the Western Buddhist Order, or the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. That's because when it was set up, it was very much seen as coming from the West. But as well as wanting to set up this movement that brought together all sorts of different aspects of Buddhism, Sangharakshita didn't want to water Buddhism down. He was really worried that he might end up with something that was a bit kind of not true Buddhism. So he wanted to make sure that he based the teachings on the new movement on the core teachings. So he started doing classes in a London basement, and in the early days I think he took all the classes himself. He gave all the lectures, he made the tea, I think he made sandwiches, and he led every course and retreat. But gradually he gathered around him a group of people who could start to help him out. There's some of them. I don't know who they are actually. Anybody recognise any? No? I think these are people from Manchester, maybe.
Satyajyoti.
Okay. Yeah, so gradually a whole kind of range of people, and the movement was started probably in 67 when Sangharakshita ordained people for the first time. Okay, so what's the next picture? Oh, no, go back to the... Okay, so I've talked a little bit, so you kind of get the idea that here's Sangharakshita in London in 67, 68, starting to form this new movement, this new Buddhist movement, which I think from the beginning he was very ambitious about. He wanted it to make a real difference to the world. And from his experience, both in the East and the West, he realised that there were 6 different emphases that he wanted this movement to have, which is what I'm going to explore now. So the first one is the one up there that says ecumenical. So ecumenical is a word that comes from the Christian tradition, and it means it transcends the difference between different churches or different sects, between different religions. So it's very much, it's coming together. So it's very much about the underlying unity of Buddhist thoughts. So in the Triratna Buddhist movement, we don't, as you know, identify with one particular sect or tradition at all. What Sangharakshita has done is he's drawn up the core teachings of Buddhism and presented those in a particular way. And I think he very much believes, and so do I, that in order for Buddhism to really take root in the West, or in the kind of global culture now, that's going to happen. It's going to have to step outside those traditional ways of looking at Buddhism that are expressed through a particular culture. It's like we have to look at what's underneath that. And in some ways, although I think Sangharakshita has actually given us a really clear and strong basis, that work is just ongoing now. How to communicate the Dharma to our peers, our contemporaries, is something we're just learning how to do as a movement all the time. But if you do this thing about, you kind of look at the Buddhist movement, you kind of go, oh, I'll have a bit of that, and I'll have a bit of that, and I'll have a bit of that, you could get yourself in quite a lot of a mess, because you could end up just choosing all the kind of really glittery, exciting bits, you know, whichever appeals to you. Like you might choose over-the-top rituals, if that's what you're into, or you might, you know, there's all sorts of things you might do. And I think what's great about Sangharakshita is actually, he's not done that. He's chosen to look at the essence of the teachings behind it, and then he's put it in a very clear way for us to understand, a very clear framework. And one of those ways that the framework is expressed is through the system of spiritual practice, it's called. And Bodhinaga's going to talk next week about the system of spiritual practice. And that's great. You can see very clearly in that system how meditation practices we do fit together, but also how the whole of our lives can be involved in this framework of a spiritual practice. Okay, so that's the first one, it's ecumenical. So it's not coming just from Thai Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism, it's bringing together the core of Buddhism. So the second emphasis that Sangharakshita made sure was going for refuge. In fact, the full title of it is The Centrality of Going for Refuge to the Three Jewels. So, that might speak to you, in which case that's fantastic. But if it doesn't, I'm just going to explore that a little bit. So first of all, going for refuge. Now let's start with the three jewels, actually. So the three jewels are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And I've got this slightly out of order in those pictures, actually, so if you just go through a few, because you should, yeah, there we go. So, on the cases that we wear, we have these three colours representing the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the three jewels. And in fact, the name that we're now known as, the Triratna Buddhist community, Triratna means three jewels. So Ratna is jewels, Tree is three. So basically we are the community of the three jewels. So that's very much saying we are the community that puts at the heart the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Yeah. And in some ways, what is important to see about this idea of going for refuge is the Buddha is seen as a refuge, for instance, not because he helps us to escape from life. It's not a kind of escapist kind of thing. It's very much because actually his example, his teachings, they give us actual ways of being in the world that will work. So they give us reliable ways of responding. So we have all sorts of refuges we go to in the world. They can be all sorts of things. So we might have, so refuges in a way are those things which you just think, if you're in a bit of trouble or you're unhappy, you just think that's what's going to make me happy. Okay? And there can be all sorts of things. Like, so some people can have to-do lists as a refuge because it's kind of great when you tick them off, that's one. Or you might have, when things aren't working out for you, you think, well, my partner will sort this out for me. He or she needs to be my refuge. That's where I need to go. Or you might have, when things aren't going well, you think, well, a bit of alcohol, that's my refuge. A bit of kind of losing touch with reality, that will help me. You might, all sorts of things. I mean, there's just loads and loads of different ways that we think will actually give us happiness long term. And the trouble is that they don't. That's the trouble, is that as you'll remember, reality is, well, everything changes. Things are by nature unsatisfactory, and nothing is of itself existing and will give us satisfaction. So basically, reality, the nature of reality, means that we can't get satisfaction from it. So that's why going for refuge means putting at the core of our lives, at the heart of our lives, the Buddha, because he was enlightened and was able to teach us a path. The Dharma, because that's his teachings. The Dharma is the realities, the way things are. And the Sangha, because that's the community of people that are practicing. So by the centrality of going for refuge to the three jewels, what we're saying is that we're moving all the time towards having the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha at the centre of our lives. And so that, I suppose, in terms of the Buddha, that's about knowing more about him, understanding more about his life and his teachings. The Dharma, that's obviously about studying the teachings and actually thinking about them and putting them in practice into your life. And the Sangha, well, it's really important to have a clear understanding that the Sangha we go for refuge to is not us lot really. It's actually what's called the noble Sangha. So it's the kind of community of people who are enlightened, who we can actually rely on. So it's very important that we have Sangha in our lives and that we're working to have good communication, honest communication within the Sangha. But you wouldn't see us, don't go for refuge to me, for instance. maybe there might be other people here you can go to refuge for, I don't know. But it's like, basically, in terms of going for refuge, it's very much what's known as the Arya Sangha, the noble Sangha that we go for refuge to. Okay, so what's important about that, an important thing about going for refuge, and why Sangharakshita was so keen to have it as a central part of one of the emphases, is that in some Buddhist communities, it kind of has got a bit messed up over the years. And I think all Buddhists would say that going for refuge is a really important part of what they do. But in some ones, it has got a little bit kind of confused about, well, maybe it's only monks and nuns that really go for refuge, and maybe lay people can't really do that. What lay people need to do is just help the monks and nuns and help that next time round they'll get born into a monk lifestyle. And people might get a bit, so it might be that a lay person is really practicing really hard and a monk isn't practicing at all. But because they're wearing the robe and all that kind of stuff, they're seen as being higher than the lay people. So very much within our movement, it's seen that going for refuge is primary and lifestyle is secondary. That's the little kind of phrase that Sangharakshita made up. So he then changed that to show that, to put in, going for refuge is primary, lifestyle is secondary, but ethics are really important as well. So it doesn't matter, you can't just be living any kind of lifestyle. So the Triratna Buddhist Order, as you can see, is neither monk nor lay. So basically in our movement, some people would live a monastic life, and some people live very much a family life. Living in the world, earning enough money to bring up a family. But there's no reason that they aren't practicing as much as or more than people who are leading a monastic lifestyle. Though it's important to bear in mind conditions as well. So although we can practice whatever our lifestyle is, conditions do affect us. And we can find new ways, perhaps we're finding new ways, because the Western world is very different. Our world today is very different from how it was in India 2,500 years ago. So we can find ways that sometimes perhaps we're in the world, and sometimes we go on retreat for long periods. Perhaps we can live in a community, but we're not celibate. There are different ways that we can actually live our lives. And I think one other important thing to say about going for refuge in the Triratna Buddhist movement is actually Sangharakshita had seen in lots of movements that people, that sometimes the people who are leading the movements weren't really practicing Buddhists. It became a bit of a society where you could maybe pay your subs and just join the Buddhist movement. Whereas in Triratna it's really important that it is actually practicing Buddhists who are leading up the institutions and making decisions. So sometimes that can seem a bit weird when you first come across it, because you kind of think, well, why are all those order members kind of making all those decisions or whatever? But it's very much meant to reflect the fact that it's coming from people who are practicing, who are committed to practicing spiritually. Okay, so the next area I'm going to look at is the idea that our order, or our movement, is a unified movement. And what that really comes from is that it's open, particularly the order, is open on equal terms to men and women. Because actually even today, some Buddhist groups, there is not an equality between men and women. So for instance, the traditional rules that govern how monks and nuns are would traditionally say that the most, so say someone's made a monk today, is very young, very inexperienced. The most experienced nun, however long she's been practicing for, whatever her practice, she is kind of lower in the hierarchy than he is. So does that make sense? So it's basically, however experienced any nun is, she is lower in the hierarchy than any monk. And I think that comes out from all sorts of traditional things that were going on in India around the time of society. In fact, the Buddha did a lot of work and made a lot of effort so that women could be nuns. So the Buddha really did what he could, but there were certain rules that were just put into place. Now, in some Buddhist groups, those rules are still going today. And also, I think that it's true in quite a lot of Tibetan groups that when it comes to ordination, women don't ordain women, it has to be a man that ordains a woman. Whereas in our Buddhist movement, very much women can ordain women. So there are some quite groundbreaking, I suppose, parts of our movement in terms of equality between men and women. There's also, I think, equality between cultural backgrounds, between caste, between people from different, all sorts of different backgrounds. And hopefully there are some pictures that will show some of this. Okay, so this is at Bodh Gaya. So this is Bodh Gaya, is the place where the Buddha was enlightened in India. And in 2009 there was like a big convention of lots of different order members came together. And here you can see there are women order members from India, there's Subhuti, who's from the UK, so there's a whole variety of people. What I actually wanted to have a picture of, which I couldn't get hold of, was when we went on pilgrimage to India, very much we were often led in kind of various rituals and things we did and practices we did in places like this by Vajratara, who's a young woman, a young Western woman, and by Manidharma, who's an Indian guy. And it was just amazing to have them leading, because to have a woman and a guy who's from what would have been seen as outside the caste system and ex-untouchable, leading a group of Buddhists like that was quite a powerful thing, actually. That's the next best picture I could get to, the picture of Vajratara and Manidharma together doing that. But I think for other people that was quite a shock. It was like, oh, there's a young woman and there's this guy who's Indian leading this whole load of Westerners. So I suppose that's all I really need to say about the unified nature of our community. Okay, so the fourth thing is the importance of friendship. I'm not going to say very much about this because time's running out, and Surimati is going to give a talk on about it quite soon. But friendship is just really key to our movement, and I think it's something that Sangharakshita just saw really clearly, that actually in the West, perhaps friendship has been somewhat undervalued compared to how it used to be in other cultures, because we can tend to get into little nuclear families, and that becomes the core of where we are, and those families move around, and they lose touch with other community, with the community, their relatives, and with friends. And so very much developing friendship, which then leads to developing Sangha, is really key to this movement. And if you go to any other Buddhist groups, I think, most of them anyway, they don't really have such a strong sense of Sangha as we do. Sangha is really important in this movement. So I'm not going to say anything more about that. I'll leave it to Surimati. The fourth aspect is around work and life. So, this is a very distinctive emphasis to us, because obviously how we work, right livelihood, is a traditional Buddhist teaching. It's there in the Noble Eightfold Path that we should have a right livelihood. But I think what Sangharakshita and his other people at the time in the sort of late 60s, early 70s saw is how important, if we're going to have a thriving Buddhist movement, how important it is that we make inroads into the economic life of the culture as well. That it's not just something that individuals kind of do on their own in their spare time. And in fact that it's more just than a Buddhist might have an ethical occupation, but that actually we can go further than that, and we can kind of create different ways of working together. I don't know what you'll get next. Oh, just some more Indian ladies. Okay, yeah, that one. Okay, so this is, you probably all know about the Evolution shop down in Orchard Square. And the Evolution shop actually is one of the few of the Evolution shops in the movement that's Buddhist, completely run by a Buddhist team. And it's part of a big group called Windhorse Evolution Training, which employs 150 people, something like that. And it's very much based on what's called team-based right livelihood principles. Which means that the work there is about creating dana, creating generosity to give money to other projects. It's about working together as a team and developing ethics, developing communication about working together. It's a context for people to work together and to develop their spiritual practice as well. And working together can be a really, I mean, it's obviously like, it takes up a huge, great part of our lives. So by working in teams together, people can really make big steps forward. And I'm not going to say much more than that because there will be talks later on, short talks about people who are actually working in team-based right livelihood. Okay. And I think Ken Story is also going to talk very much about how Sangharakshita's vision is for the principles of Buddhism to be reflected in the world, to go out into the world. Okay, so go back a step actually, because I just want to kind of give a bit of a thing. So this is from Karinar. So this is another way of working together actually, I'm just going to talk about. So the Karinar Trust raises money, a lot of money, millions and millions of pounds it's raised over the years for work in India, particularly with some of the poorest, most excluded members of the community. And what you can do, if you can't work in a team-based right livelihood, you can't work together if that's not open to you, what you can do is you can go on 6-week retreats where you work in a team raising money for Karinar. So I just wanted to bring that up as an example. Okay, so so that's very much work and life. So team-based right livelihood in there is a particular emphasis, but actually the whole fact that, you know, we perhaps spend an evening, 2 evenings, 3 evenings here or something at the Buddhist Centre every week, but we have a lot of life going on apart from that. So it's really important to Sangharakshita that we're practicing in our everyday life. And then the sixth one, the last one, is the spiritual value of the arts. So I think Sangharakshita himself, when he was lying in bed, when he was 8 to 10, he read quite a lot of poetry, and he came across lots of pictures, you know, art, of famous paintings, and they really spoke to him. I think he had quite a very strong aesthetic sense. And in fact, at first it looked like he was going to be an artist who started painting himself. But when he came across literature, he realised that he wanted to write. So he's written a lot of poems, and the arts is very important to him. And he sees it as being very important to us as well. I think it's kind of representative of beauty. It's about being in touch with beauty can really help us to practice and to develop. And what's quite interesting, I think, is that apparently most of the cultures that Buddhism came into contact with didn't have a very strong cultural practice already, apart from China. Whereas, of course, the West has a very strong cultural history going back thousands of years. So it's going to be really interesting to see how we manage to develop new images of the Buddha, new images of enlightenment, new images of the three jewels. Okay, I think I'm not going to say very much more about art, I suppose, except that there's, in some ways, by being involved in the arts, by maybe participating ourselves in the arts, or by going along to an exhibition, reading a novel, watching a really good film. There are various ways that we can grow. So it can really help us to broaden our experience and our sympathies, because we find out about how other people live. We get an insight into other people's lives. It can also enlarge our imagination, so we can really start to become more imaginative, to develop that imaginative faculty, as it's called. It's a bit like we're probably being able to develop our imagination can really help us in meditation, and it can really help us in our relationships with other people. And probably we haven't had much encouragement in our lives to develop that side of us. So by developing our involvement in the arts and developing our imagination, it's a bit like we can build up our imaginative kind of muscle, and we can actually start to have a much more lively imaginative life. And art also really helps us to sort of refine our emotions and redirect them. And I think also great artists usually express the Dharma in some way. If something is a really great work of art, the artist probably will have said when they, that they were in some other kind of mode of being when they made that piece of work, that they were in touch with something higher. And by us engaging with that, we can also start to get in touch with that. So by listening to some music, looking at some paintings, we can start to feel a sense perhaps of what the artist was experiencing. So being involved with art can actually help us to grow spiritually as well. Okay, so those are the 6 emphases. I'm just going to finish with a little bit of seeing what the pictures are. I'm speaking to them. Okay. Oh. Okay. So 2 weeks ago, Helen and I and her baby, Alex, went to see Sangharakshita. And he's doing really well at the moment, actually. It was really lovely. His health is really good. I don't think his mind was ever affected by ill health, but his body seems pretty good at the moment as well. And we had a really nice time. I think I'm moved by a lot of things in these pictures, actually. It's lovely to see Helen and Alex. But I particularly like the fact that Sangharakshita's holding that bit of heather. Because I didn't know what to give him. Because he's a man who gets a lot of presents. I don't know what to give him. So I went for a walk up Wynn Hill the day before we went to see him, and I picked him a sprig of heather. And when I gave it to him, I felt like he just really took it in. So he can't see, so he couldn't really see it, but he spent such a lot of time exploring it, and just kind of, and heather doesn't smell that much, but he just really, and he held it for ages. And I just felt like I'd kind of been given a teaching on how to accept a present. It was really moving, actually. Yeah. So yeah, you can go and see Sangharakshita, and I'd recommend you go and do it if you want to know more about him. You just get in touch with his secretary and go and see him, and you usually get about an hour with him, and you can talk about whatever you like. And I think that's one really good way of just getting to know the founder of our movement, and you may not have much more time in which to do that. And I think, hopefully we'll carry on in this movement, and it's just great the more of us that have met him, because then we can tell other people about it as well. So I'm actually I realised doing this talk how grateful I am to Sangharakshita for lots of different things. I think for setting up this movement that works, basically, that has a whole load of structures and institutions and ways of being that support people to practice, that support me to practice. And in some ways, the best way that we can express that gratitude, if we feel it, is actually to continue his work, is to continue putting his vision into action. So the best way we can express our gratitude is by practicing ourselves, and by doing what we can to help the teaching of the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha to grow.